Hello everyone, today we read and comment on a 20-second paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being "From the diversity in mental individualities arises the diversity of ways leading to the end." The text follows. It is this great diversity in mental individuality, the influence of which is to be supposed as chiefly felt in the higher ranks, because it increases as we progress upwards, which chiefly produces the diversity of ways leading to the end noticed by us in the first book, and which gives to the play of probabilities and chance such an unequal share in determining the course of events. Now, as you understand, this is a reflection that I particularly like, really, because in this research for a theory of the art of war, right, von Clausewitz stresses that the individual qualities of humans are not of absolute value, right, for the sake, of course, of winning. What does this mean exactly? Well, it means a lot of things. First of all, the first one is that you can win even if you are not particularly talented, right? Sometimes we think that who wins and who loses is generally always the most capable person, or the person who had it easier, right? Most of the times it's not the case, and what I'm saying is that objectively it's difficult to find a completely inept commander that wins against the odds, right, against a much more skilled and or advantaged one. But it's also to be considered that most of the fights are objectively between forces that are pretty even, right? It's very rare, historically speaking, to find armies fighting with a huge disproportion in actual moral and material forces. Many of you will say, oh, well, the Spartans at the Thermopylae. Well, even if you look very carefully at the sources and make a kind of realistic analysis, that wasn't that disproportionate either. But even in that case, you get that impression because you count numbers, right? But quality, of course, and moral force has a great importance, but we've never talked about Battle of Thermopylae actually, but it's a much less, let's say, romantic picture than anyone is usually told. It's very inspiring, very important. It was of dramatic importance, etc., but it was actually much more resemblant, like, if not an average battle, at least something that could be balanced, pretty considered as still in the norm. Just think that probably the Spartans hadn't gone there to die, right? Which is often said, like, oh, they knew they were outnumbered and they went there just to die. Absolutely not. They hoped they could retreat, actually. And they couldn't at one point because they were outflanked, as you know. But that's another story, and that's also a good example to show you what I'm trying to say here. Without too many digressions, which I always make, that actually the reasons for which battles are decided, clashes, wars are decided, are sometimes extremely more complicated and unpredictable and unmeasurable, right? This is what von Clausewitz is saying, actually. Then it's commonly thought, and that we have a bias to reduce everything in history essentially to a deterministic approach, to a determined condition that, in this sense, is to be considered like as if those people went there just to win or lose, right? Sometimes I hear disturbingly often this way of storytelling. By saying, that battle had to be won by those guys because, we all know that those guys were stronger and cooler and whatever, and history proved it because those were the ones who won and the other guys were the ones who lost. Well, this is not really a way of a healthy way of reasoning. First of all, not just in historical terms, but especially I think it's a pretty unit indicator of of military historical ignorance, in the sense that, in fact, this is something that you have studied any battle seriously from the sources, any campaign, which is something also usually much broader, that takes sometimes can take even 1 year to do properly, like historical professionals do. Well, you wouldn't dream to think, because the whole thing is so complicated, and this parallelism makes you understand very well what von Clausewitz is actually referring to, is that reasoning in that way that we have just criticized, it is in fact to build kind of a to presume, to assume the existence of a positive theory of the art of war, for which you can tell from just, for example, the way you deploy your men and numerical material base, how that can end without any further need to add, not maybe just leadership or morale that are often not considered, but literally all the rest that can happen during war waging, right? And that's also why people are generally obsessed about battles, because they're objectively cooler, right? They are the moment in which everything seems to be like the resolutive point, right? But most of the times what happens in those battlefields is the product of much larger things that have occurred and that might have done such an enormous difference on that very battlefield, and that triggered the possibilities for that clash to occur in the first place. What do I mean? Well, just think about it, just physically speaking, if that's what you're just interested in. Think about the amount of energy in joule, right, that an army can consume in a battle of some hours, right, and the one that it consumes while camping for months, right, and tell me at that point the sheer amount of resources that were consumed, and given the relatively small differences that sometimes make really a difference, the small influence factors that make the difference between victory and defeat, if those are factors that you could not to take into account when extending the outcome eventually of the battle to very often the one of an entire campaign, of an entire war, right? So this is actually so simple once you get into the right tracks, right? It's the first time there is a almost instinctual, idiosyncratic attitude to whoever hears about these things the first time, especially if that they're not acquainted to. I wouldn't say just, especially those who, I believe it happens most when people are acquainted with history, right? And they think they know it all without maybe having even studied military history specifically, and needing to make these banal simplifications by simply saying, oh no, well, at Pharsalus, Caesar had to win because he was the best. Who knows? And do you think you know how the Battle of Pharsalus actually went? Right? Were you there? Do you think that the sources that we have are actually reliable? That's actual history, actual reality of what happened. Would us know such things? And what do we know, however, about battles in general? This is what the military historian starts doing, like saying, once you study battle after battle, campaign after campaign, army after army, you start noticing things that make you understand how, from one side, there is a degree of homogeneity, first of all, in the general forces involved, like at the point that it's really small things that make the difference, and secondly, how such, the outcome of battles and of wars, etc., is very often determined by completely not just random factors, casual factors, of course, but also and especially by much larger, let's say, conditions that are constantly taken out of the equation because, hey, it's cooler to study battle and pretending that it's all about that, right? That's also why it's generally not a good idea, unless you have strictly tactical interests, to study battles without their without their context, without their strategic background, right? It's always a risk. For example, I make videos about battles that usually last very long because more, let's say, longer at least than the usual. Because we read sources, don't we? So we try to dissect at that point the difficulty, first of all, in the reconstruction of the tactical development of the battle proper, right? But if we were to take into account literally everything about, for example, all those strategic factors that influenced the battle, it's, of course, we have to do it minimally, right? If anything, think about the battleground or why they got there, what was morale, etc. Well, we would have to spend like entire months speaking about the same campaign. It's very difficult to do, and it's kind of sad because, telling the truth, I would like to talk with you more about campaigns, right? We did it. I think we before we mentioned the Thermopylae, but I think one of the few campaigns videos I made have to do with the Battle of Marathon, right? Let me check. I made Campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria, 425 BC. That's a hell of a, and that's Thucydides, and that speaks for itself. And also the Marathon Campaign, 490 BC, a strategic analysis, right? And I don't think I did else. Yeah, okay, we talked sometimes about the Justinian War of Reconquest, but that's not quite a true campaign as a video, as a strategic analysis, right? But just to make you understand the grounds around which we are moving, right? And this is conceptually, and this is what von Clausewitz stresses here, is not only the peculiarity of mind, like we've seen the other time in the relative paragraph, but how the diversity in mental individualities arises. Diversity of ways leading to the end, which is a beautiful image, right? And as von Clausewitz makes you understand that even if you are different from someone else, this doesn't mean that you cannot be able to achieve success in a particular thing, right? Of course, this is not like daydreaming, like saying, okay, well, like those people who believe that, I can do everything. Yep, theoretically you can do everything, everybody can, and that's kind of empowering, but also we need to understand yet how to arrive there, which is really the problem, and which von Clausewitz will teach us pretty hardly, right? Because that's what reality teaches us very hardly, and that's what all we are interested in here. Here, the concept at the ends of drawing this theory of the art of war is different. It's showing you how there is not just maybe one right answer, but probably there is not even a way to determine whether that would have been the right answer. That there are good answers, and pretty damn good answers, that, however, are not the ones that, if followed, will let you achieve anything, right? You can think about this. There is always kind of a best tactical option when you make a tactical analysis, right? It's rare to find a situation in which, every option is open is on the table. There is generally, doesn't even sense to enumerate them, but there is generally one or two ideas you can have rather how to solve tactical problems, which otherwise are much, reflect a much simpler situation than they often seem, right? In the essential lines, this is also what von Clausewitz tells you. War is not even such a particularly difficult thing, and even on the battlefield, the development of battles is not so complicated and articulated, right? One of the classical principles of war is, in fact, the unity of command, simplicity, that tends to make things very, more effective, as leading, many parts of the army all together, complicated maneuvers that are normally ends. Thinking about things like the Schliffenplan, everything was calculated like chronometrically speaking, like a great mechanism. It failed, and it was doomed to fail, probably already in the way it was conceived, not even by reinforcing the right wing as it was, so but and this is what I want to tell you, is that the also what here lacks is the means through which arriving through that conclusion, right? You can't have your best plan, meaning that you maybe even find out what's the tactical solution that you need, but maybe you don't have the guts to undertake it, right? This is typical. Or maybe you don't have time, and that's of course what would modify and take out that option, but immediately, right? So and there are also certain options that, albeit wrong, can, however, produce situations that are unexpected enough to maybe revert the odds, right? Which is something, however, that would be considered, quite wisely at the beginning as impractical or impracticable, right? And these things happen all the time. And then, of course, and this is very important to remember, there is no single military action that is devoid of risk. There is never the, like, okay, I will do this, and I have a 90% chances of success. Chances of success are dramatically lower than you think all the time, right? Also because it depends on what we're talking about. It's obvious that in larger terms we reason. We may even think, I don't know, that especially when you study, historically speaking, certain stories, you may think that there is a kind of a determined idea, like that country was too weak, for example, it had to succumb to the other. Yes, but in that sense there is a kind of a criterion of proportionality, for which, of course, who is too weak to fight, as we were saying before, tendentially will not even fight, because wars usually happen when there are forces where, that presume that they have a good chance to obtain victory. There are countries that get invaded without any resistance. Why? Because they can't resist. So that's not a fitting example either. Here it's really about the means. It's definitely realizing that there is no right answer all the time, or better, let's rephrase it better. There is kind of a better best answer all the time, but it's pretty damn difficult to understand, first of all, which one it is at that given moment on the base of all the data that you constantly lack, and that's what makes it different. It's not that there is not a best option. It's that most of the times we fail to see it, to recognize it, right? That's quite of a problem, and we'll see it better with the concept of fog of war, etc. But then there is also this idea that same results or similar results can be achieved in relatively different ways, right? And these different ways actually present themselves regularly, because even when you decide to take action, this action will develop in a way that you didn't expect, right? It's as if you had, every time you have to do something, you kind of picture what it's going to be like, and you can easily find out that basically never everything you expected was as you expected it, right? And the more in war, when these expectations are based in fact on the singular darkest condition in scientific or gnosiological terms of human activities, right? And this is a great problem as well, and it has to do partially, of course, with the first one. Now, there are other ways to rephrase this. Of course, I will not insist, but the yeah, okay. Let's simply read the text and let's try to catch some more important concepts here. First of all, he writes, von Clausewitz writes, it is this great diversity in mental individuality, the influence of which is to be supposed as chiefly felt in the higher ranks, because it increases as we progress upwards, which chiefly produces the diversity of ways leading to the end noticed us by us in the first book, and which gives to the play of probabilities and chance such an unequal share in determining the course of events. So in the previous in the first book, von Clausewitz, if you remember, has drawn that kind of psychological types that that show you essentially certain more than types, certain say degrees of certain feelings, right, that can intervene, and that sometimes are related to chiefly to intelligence, to courage, to determination. And there is a kind of a better type, which is normally the cold person that can reason, without too much feelings about it, so being more rational, but that has enough courage in the form of determination to make the good, understanding, excuse me, being translated into action, making following into action. Okay, yes, and we all kind of work in that way by a certain degree. We all have, a rational capacity and some form of determination to accomplish something. So, but that's where also the intensity of these qualities is important, right? But at the same time, there are so many shades in human personality that, especially, and von Clausewitz stresses this because as much as we progress upwards in the ranks, right, in the higher ranks, tend to have a greater impact on the outcome of a military action. When a general has a particular inclination that for which, I don't know, he's more, let's say, nervous or intolerant, or he's maybe more condescending. That there are many. There can be many manifestations of this throughout through the orders, right? In the sense that the order of a general obviously influences the whole army, and for that spiritual character, that it can impact much more than, of course, what a soldier can do, the outcome of war. So this diversity is such for which you can't basically, and this is probably the most important lesson here for Clausewitz is teaching us, you can't think that by building a theory of the art of war you can measure this mental individualities, right? What the hell do you know? I mean, how do we know Caesar thought, or how, I don't know, Genghis Khan thought, or how Napoleon thought? It's a real problem here, because of course we know that they were human beings, apparently, and they had their own, their own flaws, their own personalities. They were determined culturally speaking. They had. They came from a particular context, right? We can, and this is true for every single commander in history. So all these things have a generally, I think, from a strictly historical point of view, I would say always, never think that these mindsets were unfitting for the times, right? If these individuals were so successful, it's most likely because they knew their business. Even morally speaking, they were kind of fit into their own world, to the point they were functional to their own world, and that's why they were so successful, right? So this is not to make moral relativism. This is just for saying that, of course, if you want to understand how I don't know, Hannibal thought of his strategic situation between Africa and Spain and Italy. You mustn't you should try to understand the Carthaginian nobleman of the 3rd century BC. And that the way he thought, the way he approached, considered human life, or the thought of his allies or his enemies, it's all what plausibly helped him in achieving what he achieved, right? So this is also why history is so totalizing, and it represents an advantage, because it doesn't usually seek for a quite specific thing, but it kind of gets satisfied by this synthesis capability, like saying, okay, there are many things we don't know, but since we know history and humanity a little bit, we can not presume that so much was equal to the rest, but we could kind of expect what a human would react like in a certain context, and why, and possibly for which causes, from which settings. So what this means is, of course, also in the Clausewitzian thought, is that history helps you dramatically in understanding certain things. You can't speculate something theoretical, abstract, that you don't know anything about by simply pretending, okay, well, so it's so easy to win a war, it's so easy to draw a theory of war, just have to think about how many troops I have and how I deploy them, and it's done. You can't do that. And what von Clausewitz highlights here is this, in relative terms, is the enormous importance that this diversity in mental individuality gives to the play of probabilities and chance, such an unequal share in determining the course of events. Right, so von Clausewitz here rightfully attributes to the commanders an enormous importance, tremendous importance in warfare. Right, that really the leader has an enormous responsibility, and he feels the weight. Right, all this prejudices that we have, for which we think that is at the top, is usually just a guy who's exploiting us because he's evil, and we are such pure angels. No, I mean, it can happen, but as much as we do for in our own way, in our smaller scale, and still there is an enormous pressure, right, in to take into account at a level that also remains unscopable. Like, how can you really study this? How can you quantify a moral intention or an attitude, a presentiment, a feeling? It's impossible, and this changes history so much, though, all the time, that we have to acknowledge, to assess it. At the point, we have to be extremely careful about, in fact, what we are up to, also spiritually speaking. Always remember, this is a matter of what von Clausewitz calls as moral forces, spiritual forces. Whenever you want to address them, like what is your morale here? And your morale doesn't involve just your, if you're cyclotimic or something like that. It involves your own same capability of taking decisions, and of them being constantly influenced by lots of factors that all intervene on you as an individual, as a human being, right? Aside from all this, what big machinery of an army is like, and the army reacting to the environment. So it's very important, in my opinion, to give back this human dimension to war. War is possibly the single most human activity humans do, because objectively, no other. I mean, animals have other ways that they fight, also collectively. But let's be honest, the way we make war is something that just humans do, and and this is something that the great picture has to take into consideration. How can you objectively think to study war without thinking that these are people just like you doing what they do, right? This could open to enormous moral debate, like, there are certain things that are done that I kind of don't believe in, because I suppose they are immoral for my standards, and etc. But the reality is, most of the times, what happens in certain contexts is probably the single most human thing that you would see. It's pretty difficult to realize that when you tend, in fact, to abstract yourself from reality, from the most essential context that you always have to take into account every time you can think about anything realistic in the first place. So it's a great problem. It's a great difficulty overall that has to at one point to be faced. This can happen in different ways. I don't advise you how to do it, but this is what von Clausewitz in a kind of more totalizing fashion is trying to do, right? He's making us all these examples to make us understand that the point that we instinctively are looking for does not exist. I mean, the possibility of sorting these problems simply by finding a solution that is allegedly there and it's easy to find. Most of the times it's quite not, that it's fact checkable, that scientifically calculable. It doesn't quite exist. And that's not even the point of the problem. The point of the problem, paradoxically, is the other way around. It's really observing that the best thing you can do is learning from the absence of this evidence that for a reality that does exist, though, then pretending to fix your house on on a swamp, right, without foundations, because that's really the main problem that all these military theorists have been trying to do, and they keep doing it because this is, I repeat it, this is an instinctive thing. Why do you think there are so many detractors of von Clausewitz? I mean, not so many, but that have built a relatively successful not counter thought, because they didn't counter anything, because they didn't even know von Clausewitz, but that are extremely seducing and attractive to anyone who instead wants to hear the simple version of the story, right? If you think about culturalism, for example, culturalism has a lot of responsibilities into this regard, because it basically tells you that only evil people make war. Hence, what does this even mean? Von Clausewitz just states here that it's not the case, but he explains you why it's not the case. That you can't find a typology of person that is more effective in war, or that can always achieve scientifically. Like, there is a special breed of people we could select, like we did with dogs, that can, become smart in solving war problems. That's not how it works. Right? It doesn't work that way, and especially human mind that is particularly complex and complicated and still largely unknown, to tell it all, cannot fit that, and especially no general in this sense has the time or the possibility or to take action on the basis of this abstract situations, right? Solutions, excuse me. I mean, I realize it's getting a bit far from not really far. This is really, we're still in the core of the question here, but It's like saying we could make all the most stupid examples to pretend how to make something work that only entails basically unrealistic examples, and that's what in fact the whole first book is dedicated to by von Clausewitz, to show you step by step of this by demonstrating ex absurdum, essentially how the world would be if war was that absolute free, calculable, rational activity that we could sort out, right? And the level zero of this is that there wouldn't even be war, because at that point we would all know how everything would end. So it would be that easy to put an end to that story. So without not even acting. So in other words, a great part of our civilization is built because we cannot achieve this result. It's exactly because we're limited that we need to live anyway by coping with this ignorance, with the limits of our knowledge, our understanding that have widened somewhat, right? Within still a range of possibilities, of course, that however are still effective. They're important for us to understand the whole picture. So I personally, not the whole, but what is needed to us, and this is, I think, the most important matter of the story. We are we do understand enough for what it serves for us to essentially to survive, to pass on the next generation, and that's it. And you may think, well, it's not maybe a very is that it? Well, yeah, fundamentally it is it, right? And we have to cope though, because this is still pretty fun in a certain sense. So no worry about it. You can accomplish much more than you think. And what von Clausewitz says here is astonishing and also very empowering if you think about it, as we said before. That is essentially realizing that you can achieve a result in different ways, right? There's not even there's not a single way, and the important thing here is that you don't even need to think that there is a right way, right? Because the way changes constantly, and all what is important is the outcome. It's the end of the story, and you can get there in many different ways, and with setbacks and bleeding, and you can be defeated at all times. So you can't fail at that, but at the same time you always find different ways you can get it through. Think about plans, and how do you plan things in your life? Do you reason as if now everything will go exactly as I expected, I foresaw? Well, no. You put into account, and that's what probably the best part of the plan is. What is the one that makes you more flexible, because you can think of solutions and having the ability of enacting them. That's what makes such things such plans effective, which is very different from pretending that there is always the right solution. Is like pretending to be always right, or pretending to be always successful. It simply doesn't happen. It's not a matter of you thinking about it. You have no importance in this sense. You have importance only in the measure in which you can achieve the result, and not speculating abstractly about it. And you could add a lot of things to this thought. For example, I would say I think this topic is fascinating at a behavioral level, with also to confrontate yourself with people right? After all, what are we doing here, aside from Clausewitz, my poor explanation capabilities? In general, we like to understand how things are, right? Or we hope we can get a better understanding of the reality around us. And when we study history, and we tend to study similar historical events, or at least events that other people also know and can study and can learn, etc. And therefore confrontating also with other people by saying, okay, and we have seen also 2 days ago the video I made about historical opinions, how important it is to confrontate with others, even if it's like a bad confrontation, like with, for example, if there's a fight, there is an argument, but that's still fundamental to develop your critical skills. You cannot pretend that you can learn everything by yourself without confronting with other people and debating your opinions the one on others, right? There must be a debate, and from this debate, what you learn most of the times, amazingly, is how people have different ways of seeing the world, right? In history, you will never find someone who explains you a historical event in the same way, right? And not maybe even if they were presented with the same amount of information, they studied from the same book, they didn't know, they weren't supposed to know anything else. They still would know other things, and they would have their own past experience, they would have their own temperament, their own personality, and that influences the way the talk is even done, right? That's that's vital, because we all know that, unfortunately, or maybe or fortunately, I would say more, nobody agrees on a single thing. That's the beauty of it. That's why when you think that history, like, oh, maybe this field is saturated, right? We know enough about it. Well, you find out that seemingly it's not the case. That there is always something more that you can say, because guess what? Who came before you might have known, and this is usually the case, much more than you know, and that you will ever know, likely. And there's always someone who knows more than you about a certain matter, apparently. But there is also, first of all, something that you know that nobody else knows, and that can add something important to the discussion. I think this is very important, and this explains you how important it is to be a historian at the same time. You know, at least the responsibility that it entails in telling the story, and having your own take on that, right? And you realize it, and I find it even strange, for example, on Schwerpunkt, by the degree of general agreement, I would say, that there is between us, because I don't see you to be very critical, very polemic, aside from my the length of my videos, or the quality of my audio, or also the property of my language. I don't think that you that we have really thorough historical discussions or disagreements or other things for which we always we look at things from a particularly different way. There is also, to say another thing, that though this shouldn't, of course I'm kidding, because once again there is always someone who has to say something different, but there is also, and this is where von Clausewitz thought, as we will see, will get more concrete and less astonishing for someone who is seeking for an actual answer and an actual practical use of this knowledge. that there is no hierarchy, or there is no authority, that there is no competence, that everything can theoretically be done in different ways, and that's gonna always be the same thing. It's not like that. There is always a hierarchy of some sort, just like there is in war, in fact, and it couldn't be otherwise, because it's a matter of competence, right? Competence is important. Exactly why? Because if reality was so simple that we could all read from a book and be a doctor, or being an engineer, being an historian, in fact, or being an economist, we would all read that book, and everybody all of a sudden, aside from mnemonic capabilities, would be able to apply to applicate the knowledge, right? It's not like that. It takes years and years of studying. It takes a lifetime of research sometimes, and that even not forgetting not to a real satisfaction, but to fundamentally a series of other questions that you would like to have answered. There is a lot in this sense when we talk about the competence as a form of experience, fundamentally. And that's why von Clausewitz stresses this brutally. He says, in order to be an effective commander in all this mess, all what counts is direct experience and of military command, and in part, and never forget it, this is a real thing, and it's and it's very concrete on the field as well. You must know military history, right? And that's what we are all trying to do, right? And the next step after saying, okay, I realize that there are different opinions, is to start testing the hierarchy of these opinions. And what is interesting here is that our mind is modeled to do exactly this. Like, our mind, when it doesn't, aside from those people who pretend that everybody's opinion is important, no, everybody's opinion is not important. This is a big mistake. There are opinions that are worthless, others that weigh gold, right? And also in here we should try to understand on which measure. Maybe we should have we have de facto the right to speak up our minds, of course. But if you speak up your mind 1,000 times for telling garbage, well, maybe you still must, of course, maintain your right, freedom of speech, but maybe nobody will listen to you. The point I wanted to make, though, relative to this, is that we perfectly know, we have this immediate, instinctual, right, ability of our mind to frame information we encounter with a in fact into a hierarchy, right? To frame it into a hierarchy and to think at reality like this. Like, we all know more or less what it is that we we want to know, and our bias also towards a certain theory or opinion. Like, we can have we can give the benefit of the doubt, but we all have an inherent bias relatively to. In this case, we talk about history, but it's basically about everything. We're never, and the reason of this is because, not because we're bad people, but simply because we want to know things without knowing them, but exactly because by default we don't know them, and therefore we need a structure in our mind that has developed through evolution, exactly to frame this imperfect information with a degree of order, with a degree of instinctive perception of likelihood, right, and stuff like that. That helps us to survive in this world, and it works, right? It largely works. It doesn't work all the time. Actually, our society today are so complex that this this um, uh, ability is useful up to a certain point, at least within the range of certain of certain issues, etc. But we can adapt in the sense we can study. I mean, it's not a human mind is extremely adaptive, but it also requires work to adapt, and that's why we require studying many years before being able to speak up, right? So as you know, I'm a bit of a rebellious towards the certain not certain authorities, but certain I believe there is an objective authoritativeness in this sense, but very often groups of people attribute certain authority to people who don't deserve it, right? It happens all the time, but that's at the same time how, socially speaking, those people and that authority are considered lower on the long run, and they don't have a great deal of success. Yeah, like you can have, I don't know, I was making an example the other day with Mozart and modern pop stars, right? Recent pop stars. Again, go on Facebook and see how many people listen to, I don't know, Madonna's songs and how many listen to Mozart. If you were to judge just by those numbers, you would think that Madonna is literally the most, the greatest thing ever happened to this earth, right? And obviously it's not the case, musically speaking. And the reason why is that, though, is that you should be able to understand what that much wider amount of views that compared to Mozart ones is due to, and you will realize that that's mostly due to socio-economical dynamics, education, cultural stuff that is very difficult to frame, to actually to explain. Excuse me, and that this is what von Clausewitz is telling us. That we shouldn't be tricked by appearances. We shouldn't be tricked by this illusion that the simplest way, the cheapest way, the most instinctual way is the right one, right? It's mostly the other way around. I made this example with art, with music in this case, which is not particularly fitting because I believe that art is a bit different. It works in different ways, but it's mostly kind of the same thing. The concept, though, is it's really, never think that things are easy. Never think that every time you have for example, a tranchant, sharply knitted, divided historical opinion, you can be sure that like 99%, not of the times, but of the whole opinion, that opinion is largely, in effect, is wrong, right? You say, well, how? It can't be 99% wrong. I based myself on reality. Well, that's because you presume that reality is something that is actually not, and that's where the trick stands, because you self-convince yourself that is the case, instead it is not, right? It's a big problem. And it's, at the same time, it can be solved. I mean, we're not stupid machines that once they're set that way, they don't work anymore. We work better than that. We are adaptive, as we were saying before, and we make a hell of a job when we're exposed to knowledge to understand a great deal from it. I mean, sometimes even if you're not structurally educated, for example, structurally educated in the sense that you're not a hyper specialist in a field, you still can get some of it, basically, right? It's saying, it's one of those people that in the arguments tell you, do you have a degree in psychology? So no, so you can't talk about psychology. Well, it doesn't work like that. Humans have that. That's a pretty miserable view and pretty stupid idea, that to consider humanity incapable, of understanding something just because they don't have a degree. And which means that constant exposure to certain knowledge and certain patterns and explanations is very effective in the human mind. I mean, there can be a real development, and it's difficult. Don't think it is really, really difficult. And it's like, there are these generational examples. Like, I don't know how many times you have argued with older people in general. I mean, people who are older than you. You can't be, I don't know, you may be, I don't know, I hope that all my viewers are 18 plus years old, but I doubt it. But let's assume you're 18, in fact. And even you talk about a person who is 25. Well, you will see that it's somehow difficult at one point, but also in here generational dynamics are different. I'm talking specifically about you and your parents or your grandparents, let's put it in this way, and trying to have a conversation with them about certain things. I mean, it's remarkable how, even at the point in which you make them understand, because they do understand when you say something, and here and they have really understood it, like not really being presented and refusing it, but still, however, apparently not using it integrated into a broader system, because it's as if they had antibodies at one point with their own experience, for which you can acquaint them with kind of a more evolved idea that, of course, civilization produced in the last generations, and will keep. So this will happen to all of us, if we will be lucky enough to live in long up to that point. That they don't fit, that they don't let that knowledge fit structurally. And this is very interesting, because actually when you're younger, you're more open to knowledge and to learning for a reason. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, children learn to speak at 1 year old. I mean, do you realize what does that mean? What the fact that 2 years before you were basically not even existing, not even as a fetus, and in 1 year after your birth, you're able to articulate speech by essentially listening to your parents, people around you. Do you realize what that means? That's how immense psychological capabilities. It's as if, in the space of from now, I had the intelligence of Einstein 20 per, right? In range of 1 year. It's impressive. It's fantastic. It's incredible. And then we slow down. In fact, I find ridiculous when I hear, let's invest more in education for young people, meaning for young people who are older than 18, because they're supposed to, to make them, I don't know, having a living sooner, even though they should be maintained for studying. We should invest on children. Children have an incredible mind. You can teach them a lot of stuff. I mean, for children, up to 18. But at 18, you're already old. You're already done for. When you're 24, you basically things that you learn, you can't remember it. You will forget it at one point. If you learn things when you are 12, you don't forget them, right? If you learn a language, if you learn maths, if you learn, that's the fertile age for learning. And we don't invest in these people. We assume they're stupid, right? Those are just kids. And the reason why you're so stupid by saying that is that when you were a kid, you didn't get enough education. That's the real problem. But aside from this, these are my rants about child education. But I think I'm very concerned about this, because it's like having a gold mine next to you and not investing in it. And we're obsessed about benefits in an economical, progressive sense, and we are that stupid not to invest. Well, let's skip this part. But you understand what I'm talking about, fit roughly when we address these topics. Naturally, I think that the major difficulty in all of this is to be willing to to challenge your own beliefs, which it doesn't even make to change your opinion, but to integrate it with something more functional that eventually, if what you learned was wrong, you will be able to eliminate at one point by yourself without even being asked. And this is somewhat encouraging if the results overall weren't so pure. But we poor, sorry. But we do live in a moment which we're still pretty, primitive, politically, socially. So I do expect what happens as normal still largely by a degree, and I still have faith in humanity after all, even if something tells me I shouldn't. But I'm a human myself, so I'm biased. Aside from this, I think what von Clausewitz teaches us is, as you understand, really useful, really insightful, and really realistic. All what he teaches us is basically demonstrated day after day by science, right? About from clinical psychology, but by evolution, by history itself, by sociology, by anthropology. I mean everything, and this is really this speaks also for the capabilities of human mind without a manual. Like today we think, this guy was born in 1780. He lived in the 19th, in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. We are so advanced now, right? We're smarter, we're more educated, we are so superior, right? And this is a person without all the amount of knowledge we have today, understands the world better than the average human beings that lives today, actually without this knowledge, because we have it in the sense, we own it as a civilization, but the majority of the population doesn't. So that's what the mind can arrive to perceive without, by thinking on its own way, right? In this mental diversity that or different mental individuality, as von Clausewitz puts it, that is astonishing. This guy found out all this by, not by himself, in the sense that, of course, he is still, he didn't live into prehistory. There was still some knowledge, substantial philosophical, scientific, and historical awareness at the time, but essentially precurrent time, and saying something that is still valid today, because guess what? It is what it is, for real. And this is why he will never cease to amaze me, because I honestly, and I said it also on another occasion, this is the only author I don't like. I don't follow people usually. I don't I need to follow individual. I usually don't think about von Clausewitz during my day, aside from when I make videos. But he is still a person who has not disappointed me, and that will never do, because he's stating something that is checkable, right? That is unlike my own knowledge, unlike my own interpretations that I rearrange every time I make a video. I can't say or that I improve them, hopefully, in the process as well. This guy, every time I read him, and the more I know, the more I understand, and the more it fits with, without invalidating what was said before. And I do feel somewhat the moral duty to talk about them, because otherwise, we would be talking about something else, at least. And I honestly don't have many other, ideas or feelings about the same reliance on some other thinker or whatever. It's I don't see it around, and rather than this, but whatever. Of course, I read a lot of other authors. I do have similar, of course. I appreciate people's intelligence, but kind of each own in their own field, and in a way that is competent but still not so close to scientific evidence at the point of convincing myself that this person is a genius and is never wrong. So it's, to me at least, this assumes all a greater meaning in perspective, because somewhat it seems that there were absolute values into it, and I obviously ask you not ever to take any author fideistically speaking, and just advise you from Clausewitz in terms of reliability, and then you will find out by yourself, because at that point, when you understand him, you understand this too, what I'm saying too. So it doesn't, you don't need me telling you how it feels afterwards. It's just about knowing him and knowing what he talks about, and understanding the greatness of this thinker, for what he was, and for what he wrote. Simply is that, right? So, sorry if sometimes I ramble rather too much to arrive to 1 hour video at least, but I think it's important also to repeat certain things, of course, relatively to different topics, because all of this has a great meaning if comprehended all together, like not simply as a detached knowledge, piece of information floating in the air, right, without application, which von Clausewitz would have refused pretty much. Alright, so for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.